Thank you, Claudine. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's a real honour to represent the Globe and the Folio, which we're very lucky to manage on Bankside. And also just I'll offer a thanks from the Globe to the anonymous donor who has allowed us to hold on to that folio for the next couple of years. And First Folios Compared is really just a wonderful way to bring our book to a wider audience. It already gets quite a kind of large number of eyeballs on it as it sort of sits in the foyer. Oh, there we go, wrong computer. As it sits in the foyer, kind of being looked at by people on their way to the loos and the gift shop. So it gets a lot of traffic already, but it'd be wonderful to bring it to a wider audience and let that folio catch up with some of its 400-year-old shop mates, which I think is, yeah, they've got a lot to talk about, I think. Also, a huge thanks to my colleagues at the Globe, particularly Pete LeMay, our curator, who I know worked very closely with Claudine in creating those digital images. Now, I'm very much not a textual scholar or a folio expert, and I've relied for what I'm going to talk about today on much wiser minds, some of them in the room right now. So most of what you'll hear is thanks to Emma, in large part, who's brilliantly accounted for the folio's kind of performance and performative history, particularly over the 18th, 19th centuries, and also Abigail Rokeson-Woodall, who I know was on the guest list, but I think she's in the room, and Don Weingust, both of whom have worked on 20th and 21st century actors' techniques that are kind of that draw from the First Folio. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about that and just on the sort of logic that I work at a theatre. We're being very kindly hosted by a theatre, so I think we should hear about some actors' usages of the First Folio. But I'm going to start by reintroducing you to an artefact on Bankside. It's an iconic wooden reconstruction associated with one of the most globally significant figures from the early modern world. A man who played a central role in the creation of a text of surpassing international significance. Its well-seasoned timbers are locked together in finely crafted mortise and tenon joints. Each segment and frame was meticulously constructed according to thoroughly researched blueprints, the result of devoted labours throughout the 1970s by a determined American. And the finished construction sets the stage for acts of great physical prowess and intellectual expression. And I'm talking, of course, about the working model of the printing press that sits in the exhibition at Shakespeare's Globe in London. It's what's known as a common press or a hand press, a design very little changed since the days of Caxton and identical in all its key respects to the machines in Jagged's print shop that were pulled and tugged for 20 months or more to print Shakespeare's comedies, histories and tragedies. The original of our press is a battered and shaky veteran, built sometime before 1720, now in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It's known as the Franklin press because it's said, without much authority, I have to say, to be the very machine that Benjamin Franklin worked during his brief stint as a pressman and compositor in London between 1724 and 1726. The story goes that he recognised the old workhorse on a visit back to his old haunts many years later while emissary for various American colonies in London. And not long before he helped draft the Declaration of Independence. And someone soon afterwards slapped a memorial plaque on it. In the 1840s, it was purchased by a patriotic countryman and shipped to the United States, where it's remained on public display ever since. Franklin presses started multiplying in 1978. The timber craftsman Clinton Sisson and book historian Elizabeth Harris dismantled and x-rayed the original's component parts and produced an instruction manual that would enable others to build a functioning replica. Their blueprint sparked a mini building boom of early modern hand presses, and there are precise clones of the Franklin press in the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz, the Plantin Moretus Museum in Antwerp, and then there's the model built to order in 1999 for Shakespeare's Globe. It's set up to print a page of the folio for visitors, students and special guests, and it even has a performance credit to its name, having appeared on the Globe stage in Trevor Griffith's A New World in 2009. I rather love the fact that we've got on the Globe site sort of 4 compelling material artefacts that tell a story about Shakespeare: his 2 playhouses, the First Folio of his collected works, and a replica of the press on which his plays were made to come alive for readers. And that gap between page and playhouse really isn't very big at the Globe. It's a few centimetres by my count, in the case of the folio that sits against the wall of the Globe Theatre itself. So this seems a good opportunity to reflect on the ways in which actors and theatre artists have engaged with the folio, have used it over 400 years, what it perhaps might mean to theatre artists as a working document, but also as a testament to the works of Shakespeare. So it's probably a safe bet to assume that John Hemmings and Henry Condell were among the first theatre professionals to own a copy of Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies. And whether they were chief instigators of the Folio project or the key playhouse partners of a publishing consortium, they would surely have expected to receive the volume as part payment for their involvement, and specifically for their substantial epistle to the great variety of readers. It seems unlikely that either man ever put the First Folio to extensive practical use. Hemmings's ODNB biographer suggests that he seldom acted after 1611, despite his entry among the Folio's list of principal actors in all these plays. And Condell may already have relocated to the rural surroundings of Fulham, where he died in 1627. It'd be nice to imagine that the other sharers of the King's Men clamoured for their own copies of Shakespeare's collected works, despite the steep retail price of £1. One early reader inscribed a signature alongside the name Samuel Gilburn in the list of principal actors. You can see at the bottom there. We've no reason to assume that the person who made the inscription is the player of the same name, who was a former boy actor and singer who was about 40 in 1623. And still less that it was a mark of ownership. Pen trials, doodles, random acts of copying are, as we all know, very common in copies of the folio. But then again, there's no real reason to assume that it isn't him. So we'll sort of allow that name to kind of hang there for the moment. Another early modern actor's name that crops up in another copy now in the Folger is that of James Tunstall or Tunstall, who was a member of the rival Admiral's Men during the 1590s. Now this really can't be a sign of readership or ownership by an actor, as far as I can work out, as Tunstall seems to have died before the turn of the century. So assuming it doesn't represent an entirely different and unconnected James Tunstall, which is probably the likeliest option, to be honest, maybe we could indulge in some sort of creative interpretation that perhaps the annotator was prompted by some memory of the actor's past performance, although if so, the prompt came while reading the title page of the First Folio, so that perhaps seems unlikely. So there's not really a huge amount of evidence about the life of the First Folio among the community of actors and theatre professionals that Shakespeare would have known. And that's not to say, as we've heard already, that we have no signs of the folio being put to performance use. Copies in Padua and, as we've heard, Santomare, originally in Stonyhurst, are marked up for what seems to be amateur or student performance production. Another rather mutilated volume, now in Edinburgh University Library, served to provide rehearsal scripts, plays sliced out like portions of a cut-and-come-again cake and annotated with the names of Thomas Killigrew's King's Company at Drury Lane in the early years of the Restoration. We know that Killigrew himself possessed a folio which he passed on to the playwright William Congreve, and maybe that act of bequest marks a transition in how ownership of a First Folio was understood. 18th and 19th century stars like David Garrick and Edmund Kean seemed to regard their folios as talisman, in Emma Smith's phrase, relics representing a connection to the venerable craft of English play acting. Garrick's folio, now owned by the Queen's College, Oxford, is as unmarked as an idle student's Riverside Shakespeare. By the 18th century, a new editorial tradition had emerged. Valuable Shakespeares were those collections newly edited by literary brains such as Alexander Pope and Lewis Tybald, not the 4 17th century folios. Although they loathed each other, both Pope and Tybald had the same aim: to create corrected, that's to say perfected, versions of the plays by comparison of all available textual variants. And each man harboured profound suspicion about the carelessness of theatre artists who had had the misfortune to be the custodians of Shakespeare's manuscripts in the decade between the dramatist's retirement and the publication of the folio. The errors and irregularities in the folio were naturally all the actors' fault, and it required the diligent care of textual editors to smooth out those unfortunate mistakes. And while Shakespeare as text was being absorbed into the scholarly traditions of biblical and classical criticism, theatre makers were themselves drifting quite some way from textual fidelity, with a performance tradition of Shakespeare's work that emphasised adaptation, alteration, modernisation, and in the case of quite a number, deletion from the canon of plays tolerated on the stage. Goodbye Titus Andronicus for a good 300 years. So it wasn't until the end of the 19th century, by which point the folio had long moved from its identity of old but important book into true holy relic status, that it began to be regarded as a volume with more to tell us about the mind of its author. And you can imagine the inverted commas I'm putting around mind and author in that sentence. Or perhaps I should say the theatrical vision of its author, because after 2 centuries of being superseded by new and improved models, the First Folio was beginning to glow with originary power. A Scottish librarian called Alan Park Peyton was probably the first to make the case that the specific layout and appearance of the First Folio might offer clues as to the meaning of Shakespeare's plays, with a facsimile reprint of the folio-only Scottish play in 1877, accompanied by an essay that drew attention to the significance of that play's somewhat haphazard word capitalisation. But it was the actor and theatre manager William Pole, in his campaign for a revived Shakespeare that replicated what he saw as the fleetness and clarity of the Elizabethan stage, who introduced into the actor's toolbook a concern for original lineation, punctuation and spelling. Pole's aim was clarity of verse speaking, a replication of Hamlet's advice to the players to keep the text dancing along trippingly on the tongue. Although one wonders if there has ever been a point in history when theatre makers would happily admit to diverging from such instructions. In 1923, the tercentenary of the First Folio's publication, accessible Shakespeare editions replicating the folio publication in spelling were released, introduced by Harley Granville Barker, the actor, writer and director who had absorbed Pole's principles when playing Richard II under his direction in 1899. Abigail Rokeson has traced the influence of Pole on 20th century English Shakespeare through 2 wellsprings of classical acting and directing talent: Cambridge University and the Central School of Speech and Drama. Pole's nephew was a founding member of the Marlowe Society at Cambridge, where the Bloomsbury set Don George or Dady Rylance directed plays and supervised several generations of future British theatre leaders, from Peter Hall and John Barton to Richard Eyre and Sam Mendes. Pole's faith in performance in conformity with the poet's own instructions, in his words, also lay behind the teaching philosophy at Central, founded in 1906 by Elsie Fogarty, who had previously taught Shakespeare to Laurence Olivier, John Gielgud, Peggy Ashcroft and Edith Evans, among others, and whose school would also go on to train the text and voice expert Cicely Berry and Patsy Rodenberg, as well as a constellation of Dentures, Redgraves and Wanamaker's. And I've included Giles Block in that list of luminaries, not because he was a graduate of Central, but because as Master of Text at the Globe, he very much followed in the tradition represented by Pole. So the bedrock of English Shakespeare acting for well over a century has lain on a solid respect for the texts that can bring us somewhere near the poet's own instructions, as Pole put it. And that has generally meant the appearance of the plays in the First Folio, despite the valid claims of various quarto editions to superior proximity to the intentions of the author. Peter Hall's hugely influential Shakespeare's Advice to the Players represents a thriving tradition of performance handbooks that urge actors to go back to the folio. Hall calls the quartos a motley collection, and find in the folio suggestions and clues lying latent in the verse. Folio facsimiles are a common sight in Shakespeare rehearsal rooms, rarely as working texts, but always there for reference if a debate arises about a thorny punctuation mark or a questionable aside. Modern actors have become experts at combining a Polian alertness to versification with a Stanislavskian curiosity about intention and objective. As Rokeson argues, actors typically mine the text, whether that's folio or an edited edition, to find out why their characters do something, not to get necessarily the music of the verse bang on. But there is also what one might call a parallel tradition of passionate folio preference alive in the US and the UK. Rokerson and Don Weingast trace this tradition back to the Austrian translator and philologist Richard Flatter, whose Shakespeare's Producing Hand in 1948 argued that the metrical irregularities, or he called them marks of expression, found in the First Folio, shared lines, extrametrical verses, irregular stresses, things like that, are deliberately placed instances of Shakespeare's art as an actor and director, although Flatter used the term producer, the then current term producer. Flatter pointed to the Bloody Captain's speech in the first act of the Scottish play, metrically all over the place, to suggest that its staccato half-lines weren't a result of textual corruption, or even worse, Shakespeare's ineptitude, but engineered into the verse as delivery instructions for the actor playing the injured and out-of-breath soldier. Throughout the book, Flatter identified occasions when Shakespeare appeared to be prompting his actors with direction or opportunities for stage business, moments which he argued would be lost if these irregularities were erased by a standardizing editor. Flatter's work was in time to lead to an approach that significantly extended the broad respect paid to the First Folio by classical Shakespeareans into something much closer to a method for folio fidelity in performance. Practitioners such as Patrick Tucker, the founder of the original Shakespeare Company, urged actors to follow characters, he called them long thoughts, from folio full stop to folio full stop, paying due attention to the different effects of the intermediary punctuation marks. He also argued for the powerful significance of parentheses and capital letters, the distinction between the expression O when set as a single capital letter, or OH, and as well as lineation and scansion, orthography deserved attention. There were differences, Tucker argues, to attend to between war and war, spelt with an extra R and an E, or me with a single or a dual E. These and other examples, Tucker argued, provided crucial information about delivery, vowel length, speed, construction of argument and emotional intention, all valuable information for an actor. Now, the differences between Tucker's approach and the more familiar classical acting tradition represented by Hall's Shakespeare's advice to the players, I think are of degree rather than kind. But it's largely Tucker and the original Shakespeare Company that got it in the neck from scholars, just as Richard Flatter did back in the 1940s and 50s. Flatter had the misfortune to publish at the height of the influence of new bibliography, represented here by the Englishman A.W. Pollard in the middle and the American Charlton Hinman. I've put up Shaw there as well to represent his opposition to William Pohl's ideas a few years earlier. New bibliographers were a body of textual scholars who believed in applying scientific principles and growing technical know-how to collation and editing in order to create definitive editions of literary classics that brought the printed book as close as possible to the original vision of the author. I'm pretty sure that's Charlton Hinman with his collation machine in that photograph. I'm definitely going to call him Charlton Heston in the course of this presentation. So key to their approach was a clear understanding of the contingencies of book manufacture and the many alterations that would be brought to bear on a text as it made its way through print, and which it was the editor's job to correct. Incidentals like spelling, punctuation, lineation, capitalization were, if not in the hands of the gods, then at least fully in the grasp of Compositor B. Flatter's close reading of folio punctuation as marks of Shakespeare's own expression could not have been further from the critical fashions of the mid-20th century. New bibliography superstars Fredson Bowers and Charlton Hinman duly eviscerated his book in reviews which slammed his apparent ignorance of early modern scribal and printing habits, and also chucked in a dose of post-war Germanophobia for good measure. The performance-minded Dady Rylands was a comparatively rare voice of scholarly support, praising Flatter for his sensitivity to sound and rhythm, and congratulating him for proving that Shakespeare composed in the wings rather than in the study. Scholarly responses, overt as well as off the record, to modern performance approaches that treat the folio as a sacred text have not been wildly different to the hostility directed at Flatter. Don Weingast describes having such practitioners described to him as the devil by a fellow academic. And it's true, it's not difficult to point to flaws of logic and misunderstandings of historical evidence in such absolutist approaches to the First Folio. The new bibliographers were not wrong in their understanding of the contingency of incidentals, and as someone who has transcribed hundreds of early modern manuscript letters, I can tell you it's perfectly possible for the same writer to spell war 3 different ways in the same sentence and not mean anything by it. But that's not really the point. Actors and directors aren't textual scholars, just as Charlton Hinman and Fredson Bowers weren't theatre artists. It's unsurprising that theatre makers and scholarly editors want different things from their engagement with the First Folio. Little is gained, I think, by judging one form of engagement by the standards of the other. And in the past 40 years, the certainties of new bibliography have dissolved like Prospero's cloud-capped mountains. Definitive editions are very much yesterday's news, and the preservation of authorial intention is an endeavour which hasn't really survived the death of the author. Authorship of early modern plays is now widely understood to be dispersed, not into the brocade-hung closets of Francis Bacon or Edward de Vere, but among circles of playwrights, companies of actors, teams of scribes, and shops full of hard-working pressmen and compositors. There's room in our conception of author for agents whose acts of creation were constrained by the size of a form or the number of long S's in a lower case. And if treating the folio as holy writ in a rehearsal room generates questions and challenge and eventually good work, so be it. It's one approach among a plurality of ways to make Shakespeare today. And we should remember that theatres like the Globe, like the RSC, like several others in the UK and the US, have treasured their connections to their First Folios. Let's see what provocations and practices it can generate on stage in the next 4 centuries. Thank you very much.
I was thinking it was really interesting because when Emma was talking, in a way, the least interesting thing about the folio with Shakespeare, and actually when you were talking, the most interesting thing about the folio with Shakespeare, it was kind of fascinating in that relationship. But I was thinking about the emphasis on the folio, and I want to think about Othello. So when you've got a text of 1622 and then a text of 1623, both of which are remarkably important in different ways, do you think there's a sense in which we are over-prioritising the folio that is going to do a disservice to some of those kind of more unstable quarto texts?
Look, I should say that I don't really hold a candle on either. Well, no, that's not true. I do hold a very strong candle in one view as a scholar and someone who is vaguely aware of the issues around textual scholarship, even though I'm not a textual scholar. But in a sense, my kind of working in a theatre hat is slightly separate from my academic hat. Abigail writes really interestingly about kind of what the effect in a rehearsal room is of bringing in textual variants, and it's not always great for the work of the performer. It's not always great for the service of the work. I think finding a text that works for the company and the director is a sort of prior job, I suppose. Working with performers and their parts, often it's sort of more helpful to have decided kind of what you're working with. I absolutely by no means would ascribe to the kind of folio preference view in terms of originary intention, in terms of when there are variant versions of a play, I would absolutely see those as distinct and see it as the job of someone engaging in a modern performance way to navigate between them and make choices that serve the work they're trying to make for now, rather than necessarily see one or other as being the text that they should be doing because it represents.
So we can bring the conflated text out of the bin. Because we were all brought up on the conflated.
But I think theatre companies have always conflated text. I think that, and they still do. I think most, certainly at the Globe, most Lears and Hamlets over the past couple of years have definitely been conflated. And any kind of any discussion that I might have from a corner kind of go, oh hello, yes, there's this critical theory that says, You know, that's not the priority at all. In many ways, I think having those variant texts is quite exciting for a director or a dramaturg. Like, oh, well, you know, they're absolutely doing that thing that, you know, Michael Warren and Gary Taylor would have a heart attack if they saw people doing. It's like, oh, we'll have that, we'll have that, we'll have that.
Probably squeeze in one more, if there's one more floating around. Nope. Well, it's time for the coffee break anyway, so just to say, yeah.